Only then did she enter the house. Thompson leaned closer to the screen. He rewound the footage, watched it again. Nothing changed. No sound. No explanation. Just the same quiet exchange. He checked the date. Thursday. Curious. He opened footage from the previous week. Again. Thursday afternoon. Again. The front door opened. Again. The same teenage boy appeared. Again. Shy smiled. Again. They walked away together. Every clip ended the same way. Hours later, Sky returned home alone, wearing the expression of someone carrying a weight she hadn't shared with anyone. A second later, a teenage boy walked into view. He looked about 16, maybe 17. Tall for his age, a backpack rested over one shoulder. His clothes were clean, but worn enough to suggest they'd seen plenty of use. His hair needed a trim, yet he carried himself with quiet confidence. The boy smiled back. Sky said something. He answered. Neither looked nervous. Neither appeared rushed. Without audio, their conversation existed only in silent gestures. The boy laughed. Sky gently nudged his shoulder, almost the way an older sister, or someone who knew him well, might. Together they walked down the sidewalk until they disappeared beyond the camera's view. Thompson frowned. He didn't recognize the kid. Jenks wasn't so large that familiar faces went unnoticed forever, especially for someone like Thompson. Owning a local HVAC company meant he spent most days meeting homeowners, business owners, teachers, pastors, and neighbors. Faces usually stayed with him. This one didn't. He dragged the timeline forward. At 6:41 p.m., Sky returned alone. She unlocked the front door. Before stepping inside, she paused for several seconds with her hand resting on the doorknob. Her shoulders sagged. She took a slow breath. By the time the clock on Thompson's kitchen wall reached 11:43 p.m., the neighborhood had gone quiet. The last porch lights along the street had gone dark, and only the steady glow from his laptop lit the room. A half-finished mug of coffee sat beside him, now cold enough that he barely noticed taking another sip. Reviewing security footage had become part of his Thursday night routine. It wasn't because he enjoyed it. A month earlier, someone had stolen a package from the front porch before either he or Sky made it home from work. 3 houses on their street in Jenks had reported similar thefts that same week. Their next-door neighbor lost prescription medication. Another family had Christmas gifts disappear before they could bring them inside. After replacing the missing items, Thompson installed 4 security cameras around the property. One watched the driveway. Another covered the backyard gate. A third overlooked the front porch. And the fourth faced the street. Most nights, the recordings were painfully ordinary. Neighbors walking their dogs. Kids racing bicycles after school. Delivery trucks stopping for less than a minute. The occasional squirrel bold enough to inspect flower pots. Tonight he expected more of the same. His cursor drifted across the timeline as he skipped through hours of harmless activity. Morning sunlight gave way to afternoon shadows. Cars came and went. Nothing unusual, until the timestamp reached 3:58 p.m. His hand froze on the mouse. The front door opened. Sky stepped outside wearing the same navy cardigan she often wore to work when the office air conditioning ran too cold. She locked the front door, glanced toward the driveway, and smiled. Not at the camera. At someone standing just outside its frame. Thompson's pulse slowed instead of racing. He wasn't angry. He wasn't ready to accuse anyone. He simply stared at the screen, searching for something the camera couldn't provide. Context. Who was the boy? How long had this been happening? And why had Sky never mentioned him? The recordings offered no answers, only questions. Questions that settled into the quiet kitchen long after the videos ended. He closed the laptop halfway, intending to leave it alone until morning. Instead, his hand rested on the lid. He opened it again. Something about those Thursday afternoons refused to leave his mind. Welcome to Hollow Creek Chronicles, a place where every quiet town has a hidden story, every stranger has a past, and every choice leaves a lasting mark. If this is your first visit, we're happy you found us. If you've been here before, welcome back. Subscribe and join us as we uncover stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. My name is Thompson, and until those security cameras went up outside our home in Jenks, I believed I knew every important detail about my life. I thought I understood my wife. I thought our routines were ordinary. I thought the biggest problem we'd face that year was keeping porch thieves away from our front door. Looking back now, I almost wish another package had disappeared instead, because a camera installed to protect our home captured something I was never prepared to see. Not proof of a crime, not a stranger trying to break in, just my wife, walking away every Thursday with a teenage boy I had never met. If I had confronted her that first night, this story would have unfolded very differently. Instead, I made a choice that changed everything. I decided to keep watching. And that's where this story truly begins. If someone had stopped me on Main Street a week before all of this started and asked whether I trusted my wife, I probably would have laughed before answering. Not because the question sounded ridiculous, because it never would have crossed my mind. By the time I turned 50, I had learned that trust wasn't built through grand speeches or expensive vacations. It came from ordinary mornings, shared responsibilities, showing up when you promised you would, and choosing each other over and over again. That was the life Sky and I had built. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We didn't have the kind of marriage people posted about online, with carefully staged anniversary photos and captions about finding a soulmate. Ours looked much simpler than that, and, in my opinion, much stronger. I owned an HVAC company that had served Jenks and the surrounding communities for almost 20 years. Most mornings started before sunrise. During Oklahoma summers, my phone often began ringing before 6. Air conditioners never seemed to stop working at convenient times. People counted on me. I counted on my crew. Over the years, I built the business one satisfied customer at a time. I never believed in cutting corners or charging people for repairs they didn't need. If a system could be fixed instead of replaced, I told the homeowner exactly that. Some people said I wasn't charging enough. Maybe they were right, but I'd rather earn someone's trust than make an extra $1,000 from one job. That philosophy kept our schedule full year-round. Every Friday afternoon, my office manager joked that if I ever retired, half the town would panic. "I hope you're planning to work until you're 90, she'd tease. "I'll think about it," I'd answer, "as long as you keep fixing my air conditioner for free." "I never said free. You've never sent me a bill." "I've been hoping you'd notice." She'd laugh every single time. It became our running joke. Life wasn't all work, though. The best part of every day was coming home. Sky usually beat me there by 30 or 40 minutes. She worked as a guidance counselor at one of Jenks's middle schools, a job that demanded far more patience than I could ever manage. Teenagers found their way into her office carrying worries they didn't know how to explain. Some struggled with bullying, others with parents going through divorce. Some simply needed someone willing to listen without judging them. That someone was Sky. She never talked about confidential conversations. She took her students' privacy seriously. But every once in a while, she'd sit quietly at the dinner table, staring into her tea. Those were the evenings I'd simply ask, "Hard day?" She'd nod. "Really hard? I'll do the dishes. You cooked." "I know. That's not fair." "I wasn't aiming for fair." She'd smile. "You're trying to score points. I've been married long enough to know they matter." "You keep a scoreboard?" "Absolutely." "And who's winning?" "I stopped counting years ago." She'd laugh, stand up anyway, and dry the dishes while I washed them. That was our compromise. Neither of us liked leaving the other with all the work. Saturday mornings belonged to us. We rarely made elaborate plans. Sometimes we'd walk through the Jenks Farmers Market with coffee in hand, pretending we weren't buying vegetables we'd forget to cook. Sometimes we'd wander into local antique stores just to admire old furniture we'd never have room for. More often than not, we'd end up at the same small diner where the waitress already knew our order. "Bacon and eggs for him," she'd say before handing us menus. "Oatmeal with fruit for you." Sky always smiled. "You know us too well." I've had years of practice. Our routines never felt boring. They felt dependable, comfortable, safe. Every evening around 8, we'd settle into opposite ends of the couch. She'd read. I'd pretend to read while secretly watching baseball. "You've been on the same page for 20 minutes, she'd say without looking up. "I'm appreciating the author's writing. The TV reflection is in your glasses. I was testing your observation skills. You failed." I noticed. Moments like those became the rhythm of our marriage. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just two people who genuinely enjoyed sharing life together. That ordinary rhythm changed because of something almost laughably small: packages. It started with complaints in our neighborhood Facebook group. Someone posted security photos showing a stranger carrying away a delivery less than 5 minutes after it had been dropped off. Another family reported losing medication. Someone else lost a birthday gift intended for their granddaughter. Within days, nearly everyone on our street had a story. One evening after dinner, I carried an empty Amazon box to the recycling bin. Sky followed me into the garage. "You think we should get cameras?" "I've been thinking about it." She leaned against my workbench. "I hate feeling suspicious every time something gets delivered." "So do I. We've never needed them before." "We've never had porch thieves before either." She nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that's true. I'll install them this weekend." She smiled. "You'll probably spend 6 hours making sure every angle is perfect." "Fear." 5. I said 4. She folded her arms. "I've watched you measure shelves." That was different. "You measured the same shelf 3 times. I wanted it level." "It already was." "Exactly." She shook her head, laughing. "I married a man who treats power tools like family. They've never argued with me." "They absolutely have. I heard you yelling at a drill last month." "It started it." She laughed so hard she had to grab my arm to steady herself. "I cannot believe I live with you." "You say that like it's a bad thing." "It usually isn't." By Sunday afternoon, 4 cameras watched over our home. At the time, both of us believed they would protect our packages. Neither of us imagined they were about to record something far more personal than a missing delivery. And neither of us realized that one quiet Thursday would leave me staring at silent footage, searching for answers I didn't yet know I needed. The first few days after installing the cameras, I barely paid attention to them. They did exactly what I expected them to do. They recorded delivery drivers dropping off boxes. They caught neighborhood kids riding bicycles a little too fast around the corner. They showed the Henderson family's golden retriever wandering into our yard whenever the gate was accidentally left open. Once they even captured 2 raccoons arguing over a bag of birdseed someone had forgotten to bring inside. Nothing worth remembering. The camera app on my phone sent motion alerts every few hours, but I usually swiped them away without opening them. Life stayed busy. Summer always kept my company moving from one service call to another. Air conditioners struggled against Oklahoma's heat, and customers wanted help immediately. Some days I left the house before Sky finished her coffee. Other evenings she was already home by the time I pulled into the driveway, waving from the front porch with that familiar smile that somehow made 12-hour workdays feel shorter. Our routines remained unchanged. At least, that's what I believed. The following Thursday, I came home later than usual after replacing a commercial rooftop unit for a local bakery. The repair had taken longer than expected, and I was exhausted. Sky had already prepared dinner. She greeted me with a quick hug. "Long day?" "You could say that." "You look like the air conditioner fought back. It almost won." She laughed and handed me a glass of iced tea. "You've got grease on your forehead." I was hoping it looked professional. "It looks expensive," That's even better. She reached up with a damp kitchen towel and wiped the smudge away. There. I was trying to impress you. You've been trying for years. Working yet? She tilted her head thoughtfully. I'll let you know. That answer earned another laugh from both of us. Dinner felt completely normal. We talked about a teacher retiring from her school after nearly 3 decades. I told her about a customer whose old Labrador refused to leave my toolbox alone. She laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. What? The dog stole your screwdriver? He hid it. You spent 20 minutes looking for it. 30. And where was it? Behind the flower bed. She covered her face. I wish I'd seen that. I lost an argument to a Labrador. It sounds like the Labrador won fair and square. By bedtime, nothing about the day seemed unusual. Not until nearly midnight. I remembered receiving a motion notification earlier that afternoon while working inside the bakery. Thinking it might have been another package delivery, I opened the security app before heading upstairs. The front porch camera appeared first. A delivery van. Nothing interesting. The driveway camera showed my truck leaving that morning. Normal. The backyard camera captured little more than wind moving through the trees. Out of habit, I opened the sidewalk camera. The timestamp read 3:57 p.m. Sky stepped outside. A few seconds later, the same teenage boy entered the frame. The one I'd seen in the older recording. I watched them exchange a few silent words. The boy smiled. Sky smiled back. Together they walked away from the house. Again, I frowned. Maybe I'd simply forgotten seeing him before. Maybe he was a neighbor's relative. Maybe someone from her school. Middle school counselors met countless students and families every year. It wasn't unusual for former students to stop by and say hello. I closed the video, then opened it again. This time I paid closer attention. The backpack. The way Sky checked her watch before locking the front door. The comfortable way they walked beside each other, instead of one following the other. There was familiarity between them. Not awkwardness. Not hesitation. Comfort. I switched to the previous Thursday. Same time. Same pattern. Another Thursday before that. Again. My finger rested on the screen. 3 Thursdays. 3 identical afternoons. The only thing that changed was what each of them happened to be wearing. Everything else stayed remarkably consistent. I leaned back in my chair. You're overthinking this, I muttered to myself. People have routines. Teachers meet students. Counselors attend appointments. Volunteers mentor teenagers. There were dozens of reasonable explanations. Probably more. I closed the app and carried my phone upstairs. Sky was already asleep. She had curled onto her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, exactly the way she always slept. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The room felt peaceful. The woman sleeping there was the same woman who reminded me to eat lunch when my schedule became too busy. The same woman who left handwritten notes inside my work cooler every Monday morning. The same woman who remembered every birthday in both our families, without ever checking a calendar. Nothing about her suggested deception. I quietly changed into a t-shirt and slipped into bed beside her. She stirred slightly. Without opening her eyes, she reached for my hand. A habit she'd had since the first year we were married. Her fingers wrapped around mine for a brief moment before she settled back to sleep. I stared at the ceiling. The security footage replayed in my mind. The smile. The backpack. The silent conversation. The walk away from the house. I felt almost guilty for even wondering about it. Trust wasn't something you abandoned because of unanswered questions. Trust meant giving the person you loved the benefit of the doubt. So I made myself a promise. I wouldn't accuse Sky of anything. I wouldn't invent stories where there were no facts. I wouldn't let my imagination damage a marriage that had been built over years of honesty. If there was a simple explanation, I would eventually learn it. There was no reason to create a problem where one might not exist. The next morning, I treated Friday exactly like every other Friday. We had breakfast together. She kissed me goodbye before leaving for school. I headed to my first service call. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, however, a small question had taken root. Not large enough to overshadow everything else, just large enough to return whenever I found myself alone. The following week, I caught myself glancing at the calendar more than once. Thursday. For the first time in years, it wasn't just another day on the schedule. It was a day I intended to watch. Not because I believed my wife had betrayed me. Because I needed to understand what those silent videos couldn't tell me. Whatever answer waited beyond those recordings, I decided it was better to find it before asking a single question. So I kept watching. I had no idea that my patience was leading me toward a truth that would challenge everything I believed I knew about the person I loved. The next Thursday arrived with a quiet confidence that made me uneasy. Not because anything had happened, because nothing had. For nearly a week, I had carried around questions that never seemed important enough to ask out loud. Every time I considered bringing up the teenage boy, another thought immediately followed. What if there's a perfectly reasonable explanation? The idea stopped me every time. After all, Sky had never given me a reason to doubt her. She still left little notes beside the coffee maker when she knew I had an early service call. She still texted me around lunchtime reminding me to drink water whenever the Oklahoma heat climbed into the upper 90s. She still kissed me goodbye every morning before heading to the middle school. Nothing about her behavior toward me had changed. If anything had changed, it was me. Thursday morning began the same as every other weekday. I walked into the kitchen just as Sky finished packing her lunch. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. You worrying about work?" "Just thinking," she smiled gently. "You do too much of that before coffee." "I've been told." She slid my favorite travel mug across the counter. "I even made it the way you like. You trying to spoil me?" "I'm trying to keep you awake." "I appreciate the effort." She laughed softly before gathering her purse. Only then did I notice something I wasn't sure I'd overlooked before. Instead of the comfortable cardigans she usually wore to school, she'd chosen a light blue blouse with neatly pressed sleeves and a pair of navy slacks. Nothing flashy, nothing inappropriate. She simply looked more polished. I watched her fasten a small pair of silver earrings. "You've got a meeting today?" I asked casually. She glanced toward me in the bathroom mirror. "Parent conferences after lunch." "Makes sense. They're usually back to back." "You'll be exhausted." "Probably." She smiled. "But it'll be Friday tomorrow." "That's always worth celebrating." She laughed. "It really is." There was nothing unusual about wanting to look professional. Guidance counselors met parents all the time. I knew that. Still, as she walked toward the front door, I found myself wondering whether she'd dressed that way the previous Thursday, or the Thursday before that. I honestly couldn't remember. That realization bothered me more than it should have. How many ordinary details had I stopped noticing, simply because life had become so routine? Work kept me occupied through most of the morning. A family on the west side of Jenks needed their aging air conditioner repaired before relatives arrived for the weekend. While replacing a worn capacitor, I caught myself looking at my watch. 11:23. There was no reason to check the time, yet I did. Again, at 12:48. Again, at 1:36. One of my technicians, Marcus, noticed before I did. "You waiting on somebody to call?" I looked up from my toolbox. You've checked your phone 6 times in 10 minutes. Have the first?" He grinned. "I wasn't counting." "You definitely were." "I got bored watching you stare into space." I forced a smile. "Just got a lot on my mind." "You sure everything's okay?" "Yeah." The answer came too quickly. Marcus nodded, though he didn't look convinced. We finished the repair, loaded our equipment, and drove to the next appointment. I spent most of the afternoon trying to focus on compressors, refrigerant levels, and electrical readings. Instead, my thoughts kept drifting back toward home, toward Thursday, toward a silent video that refused to leave me alone. That evening, after dinner, Skye stood in the living room sorting through several cardboard boxes stacked beside the bookshelf. I looked up from the baseball game. Cleaning? Trying to. She held up a hardcover novel. I forgot I even owned this. I thought you loved that one. I do. So why give it away? She smiled thoughtfully. Somebody else might need it more than I do. The boxes were filled with books, children's novels, young adult fiction, history books, paperbacks with folded corners, a few educational workbooks. She arranged them into neat stacks across the rug. I didn't realize we had this many. We don't. What do you mean? I brought some home from school. I muted the television. School's getting rid of them? Not exactly. She tucked a bookmark inside one novel before placing it into a donation box. The library replaced several older editions. A few teachers donated books from their classrooms too. What happens to these? We're giving them away. To who? She shrugged. People who can use them. That answer seemed simple enough. I stood and carried another empty box from the garage. Need help? I'd love some. For the next half hour, we worked side by side. She carefully sorted books by reading level. I taped boxes shut and wrote short labels across the top with a marker. Children, middle school, reference. When we finished, 6 boxes sat neatly against the wall. That's a lot of books, I said. It is. How are you getting all those to school? She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I'll take them tomorrow. You'll fit everything in your SUV? I think so. If not, take my truck. I'll manage. She smiled warmly. Thanks, though. Friday morning, I happened to leave a few minutes later than usual. As I backed my truck out of the driveway, I noticed Skye opening the rear hatch of her SUV. One by one, she loaded the donation boxes inside. She worked carefully, making sure they wouldn't shift during the drive. There was nothing secretive about it, nothing suspicious. I almost laughed at myself. Books. She was transporting books. What possible reason could I have for questioning that? The answer should have been none. Yet another thought quietly entered my mind. Were those the same boxes I saw on the camera footage? I couldn't remember. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the security recordings again. This time I focused less on Skye, more on what surrounded her. The teenage boy appeared exactly when he had every other Thursday. He greeted her with the same relaxed smile. Together they opened the rear hatch of her SUV. The boy lifted several boxes from the cargo area. Books. I could clearly see books. They carried the boxes together before walking out of frame. I replayed the footage. The teenager never reached for Skye, never acted inappropriately, never looked around as though hiding from anyone. Every movement suggested respect. He waited while she locked the vehicle. He carried the heavier boxes himself. When one carton slipped slightly from his hands, Skye laughed about something neither the camera nor I could hear. He laughed too. For reasons I couldn't explain, that laughter unsettled me. Not because it sounded wrong. I couldn't hear it at all. Because my mind immediately supplied a conversation that might never have happened. I began attaching meaning to expressions, building stories from silence, interpreting smiles without knowing what caused them. By Sunday evening, I found myself remembering little things from previous months. The afternoons when Skye had come home unusually tired. The evenings she'd gone straight upstairs after dinner to read. The times she'd mentioned staying late at school without explaining why. At the time, none of those moments had seemed important. Now they began lining up inside my head, as though they belonged to the same puzzle. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. The truth was painfully simple. I didn't have enough information to connect any of them. But once the human mind starts looking for patterns, it has a remarkable way of finding them, even where none exist. I didn't realize it yet, but I had quietly crossed an invisible line. I was no longer simply watching security footage. I was beginning to let unanswered questions shape the way I interpreted everything else. Monday arrived with the same alarm clock, the same coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the same morning sunlight spilling across our dining room table. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside my own head, almost everything had. I hated admitting it, even to myself. There was still no evidence that Sky had done anything wrong. No secret messages, no mysterious phone calls, no unexplained expenses, no lies I could point to. Only silent security footage and questions I hadn't asked. Yet those questions had quietly followed me into the new week. As Sky placed scrambled eggs onto my plate, she looked up and smiled. "You've been quiet lately." I looked away, pretending to straighten the newspaper beside my coffee. "Just tired." "You've said that 3 mornings in a row." "Busy season." She studied me for a second longer than usual. "You know you don't have to carry everything by yourself." "I know. If work's becoming too much, maybe let Marcus take a few more service calls." "I'll think about it." She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. Normally I would have teased her about worrying too much. Instead, I picked up my coffee and changed the subject. "You've got another full day?" "Always." "Parent meetings again?" "A couple." She smiled. "And I'm helping organize a reading program." "The book donations?" "That's part of it." She seemed pleased. "We collected more than I expected." "That's good." "It really is." I forced a smile. "Glad to hear it." The conversation ended there. Not because either of us wanted it to. Because something small had settled between us. A hesitation that had never existed before. The first customer on Monday lived just outside Jenks, in a neighborhood where I'd worked dozens of times over the years. Mrs. Carter answered the front door before I reached the porch. "Thompson." "Morning. I was hoping they'd send you. I heard your upstairs unit isn't cooling." "It sounds like it's coughing." "I'll take a look." She stepped aside. "You've saved us before. I'll see what I can do." Usually I enjoyed talking with customers while inspecting their systems. People shared stories, asked about my family, recommended restaurants I'd somehow never tried. That morning, I struggled to stay present. I removed the access panel from the unit and immediately realized I'd left one of my gauges inside the truck, something I almost never forgot. Mrs. Carter noticed. "Everything all right?" "Yeah. I think I left a tool outside." "You've been doing this too long to forget tools." I laughed awkwardly. "Guess I'm proving nobody's perfect." She tilted her head. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine." "You don't sound convinced." I picked up my toolbox. "Just didn't sleep much." She smiled kindly. "Well, don't work yourself too hard." "I'll try." Back in the truck, I sat behind the steering wheel for a few moments before driving away. I hadn't been thinking about refrigerant pressures. I'd been wondering whether Thursday would look exactly like the previous 3 Thursdays. The distractions followed me throughout the week. On Tuesday, I misread an equipment order and had to return to the supplier. On Wednesday, I nearly left a customer's thermostat sitting on their kitchen counter after replacing it. Marcus finally spoke up during lunch. "You're somewhere else." "What do you mean?" He set his sandwich down. "You've been somewhere else all week." "I've just got a lot going on." "You usually joke through the whole day." "I still joke." "You smiled once yesterday." "I smiled twice." He grinned. "I counted." I shook my head. "You really need a hobby." "I've got one." "What's that?" "Making sure my boss doesn't burn himself out." I looked at him. For a moment I considered telling him everything. Not because I wanted advice, because saying the questions out loud might have made them sound less convincing. Instead, I simply said, "I'm okay." Marcus nodded slowly. "If you say so." He respected my answer. But I knew he didn't believe it. At home, Sky noticed changes before I realized I was making them. Thursday was still a day away when she found me standing at the living room window after dinner. "What are you looking at?" "The Hendersons finally fixed their fence." She stepped beside me. "You've been staring at the mailbox." I blinked. "I have? For almost a minute." "I guess I was thinking." She slipped her arm through mine. "You've been doing a lot of that." "I know." She rested her head lightly against my shoulder. "Is there something you're not telling me?" The question landed harder than she intended. My first instinct was to ask one of my own, "Who is the teenage boy?" Instead, I looked toward the quiet street. "No." "You promise?" "I promise." The word left my mouth more easily than I expected. Technically, it wasn't a lie. There wasn't something I wasn't telling her. There were dozens of things I wasn't asking. She squeezed my hand gently. "If anything's bothering you, we'll figure it out together. We always do." She smiled. Exactly. Her confidence should have comforted me. Instead, it left me feeling guilty. Not because I'd done anything wrong. Because I had started keeping thoughts to myself that would have once become conversations. The change was subtle, almost invisible. Neither of us argued. Neither of us raised our voices. We still ate dinner together. Still watched television in the evenings. Still laughed occasionally when one of us made a terrible joke. Yet tiny moments began slipping through the cracks. I stopped telling her every story from work. She stopped interrupting her reading to ask how my afternoon had gone when she noticed I seemed distracted. Not because she cared less, because she sensed I wasn't fully present. Silence began lasting a little longer than it used to. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to notice if you lived inside the marriage. One evening, she handed me a bowl of popcorn while we watched an old movie. Our fingers brushed. Normally, I'd make some ridiculous comment about stealing the bigger share. Instead, I quietly thanked her. She glanced at me. "You're unusually polite." "I am." "You usually argue about popcorn." "I don't argue." "You absolutely do." "I negotiate." She laughed. "There you are." For just a second, everything felt normal again. Then my phone vibrated. A routine motion notification from the front camera. I looked down, automatically. She noticed. "You checking work?" "And no." "What is it?" "The security app." "Oh." She reached for another handful of popcorn. "I forgot those things even existed." "I check them every now and then. They've been pretty boring." "Yeah, they're doing their job." "They are." She smiled and turned her attention back to the television. I remained looking at my phone for another moment before locking the screen. She hadn't reacted. She hadn't seemed nervous. She hadn't asked what I'd seen. If anything, she sounded genuinely uninterested. That should have reassured me. Instead, my thoughts began working against me again. Maybe she wasn't worried because she had nothing to hide. Or maybe she knew exactly what the cameras could and couldn't see. I hated myself for even thinking it. The person creating these possibilities wasn't Sky. It was me. By the time Thursday morning finally arrived, the uncertainty had quietly reshaped my entire week. I had gone from trusting my wife without question to analyzing ordinary conversations for meanings they might never have carried. I still hadn't confronted her. I still hadn't asked a single question. But I had reached a point where watching another silent Thursday no longer felt enough. For better or worse, I needed to see what happened beyond the reach of our cameras. Thursday arrived without announcing itself. The sky over Jenks was clear, and the morning forecast promised another hot Oklahoma afternoon. I left the house, carrying my lunch cooler and tool bag just as I always did. Sky walked me to the front door. "Drive safely," she said. "You too." She straightened the collar of my work shirt. "You forgot this." "I've reached the age where I forget everything," she smiled. "Not everything." "No? You still remember exactly how I take my coffee." "I'd be in serious trouble if I forgot that." "You definitely would." I kissed her on the forehead. "Have a good day." "You too." Nothing in that exchange sounded different from hundreds we'd shared before. That made what I was planning feel even heavier. I climbed into my truck, pulled away from the curb, and drove toward my first appointment. Or at least that was the plan. Instead of heading directly to the customer's house, I pulled into the parking lot of a small convenience store several blocks away. I sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The engine idled quietly. "What are you doing?" I whispered to myself. I wasn't proud of the answer. For nearly 5 minutes, I argued with myself. One part of me insisted I should turn the truck around, go to work, and trust my wife. The other part reminded me that every Thursday looked exactly the same on the cameras. The only way to stop wondering was to learn the truth. Finally, I picked up my phone. I called Marcus. "Morning, boss. Need you to cover the Henderson replacement." "You okay?" "Yeah, I've got something personal to take care of." "No problem. I'll meet you this afternoon." "You sure everything's all right?" "I will be." After hanging up, I hated how uncertain those last 3 words had sounded. The morning passed painfully slowly. I stayed busy enough to avoid drawing attention to myself, completing one small maintenance job before lunch. Every time I checked the clock, it felt as though only a few minutes had passed. By early afternoon, my thoughts had become impossible to ignore. At 3:15 p.m., I parked several streets away from our neighborhood. I knew exactly where the sidewalk camera stopped recording. If I remained far enough back, neither Sky nor anyone walking with her would notice my truck. The wait lasted longer than I expected. Children returned home from school. A mail carrier crossed the street pushing a small cart. 2 neighbors stood near their driveways talking about lawn care. Everything looked completely ordinary. At 3:58 p.m., our front door opened. Even from a distance, I recognized Sky immediately. She wore the same light blue blouse I'd seen hanging in our closet that morning. She walked toward her SUV and opened the rear hatch. A few moments later, the teenage boy appeared from the sidewalk, exactly like the security footage had shown. He greeted her with an easy smile. She smiled back. Neither looked nervous. Neither looked as though they expected to be watched. The boy immediately reached into the back of the SUV and lifted one of the cardboard boxes. Books. I could clearly see the word middle school written across the side in black marker. Another box followed. Then another. Together they arranged everything inside the vehicle before closing the hatch. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing secretive. For one brief moment, I almost started my truck. I nearly laughed at myself. They're loading donated books. That should have ended it. Instead, I kept following. Sky pulled out of the neighborhood at a normal speed. I waited until another vehicle separated us before joining traffic. I stayed several car lengths behind, far enough away to avoid attracting attention, close enough not to lose sight of her. She drove across town toward an older part of Jenks I rarely visited unless a customer called from that area. The neighborhoods became quieter, the streets narrower. Eventually she turned into the parking lot of a modest brick building beside a small community park. Children played on swings nearby while a few parents watched from shaded benches. Several cars were already parked outside the building. There were no large signs visible from where I stopped across the street, only a simple entrance with glass doors. Shy parked. The teenage boy climbed out first. He carried one of the boxes toward the entrance. She followed with another. Several minutes passed. People came and went through the front doors. An older couple walked inside carrying grocery bags. A young mother pushed a stroller toward the building. Nothing about the place appeared hidden. Nothing suggested secrecy. Still, I stayed where I was. When Sky and the teenager came back outside, they weren't carrying the boxes anymore. Their hands were empty. The boy said something. Sky laughed. He laughed too. Even from across the parking lot, I could see how naturally they interacted. Not formally, comfortably, as though they'd shared many conversations before. They walked toward the SUV together. The teenager stopped beside the passenger door. Sky faced him. She placed one hand lightly on his shoulder. He lowered his head for a moment. She spoke again. Whatever she said caused him to smile. A second later, she wrapped both arms around him. It wasn't a quick handshake. It wasn't the brief side hug acquaintances sometimes exchanged. From where I sat, it looked warm, familiar, personal. The teenager hugged her back. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Every reasonable explanation I'd been repeating to myself over the past 2 weeks suddenly became harder to hear. I couldn't hear a single word they exchanged. The distance swallowed every sound. All I could see was the embrace. My heart immediately supplied the rest. Maybe she'd been comforting him. Maybe he'd received good news. Maybe there was an explanation I simply couldn't see. But in that moment, those possibilities felt painfully distant. The image in front of me overwhelmed everything else. They stepped apart. The teenager waved before walking back toward the building. Skye remained standing exactly where she was for several seconds. She watched him disappear through the entrance before climbing into her SUV. I stayed where I was until she drove away. The drive home felt much longer than it actually was. The radio remained off. Traffic moved around me unnoticed. My mind replayed the hug again and again, searching for details that might change its meaning. There weren't any, only silence. The same silence that had haunted every security recording. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized something had shifted inside me. For days, I had been searching for answers. Now I believed I had found one. Whether that belief was true or not no longer seemed to matter. Without hearing a single conversation, without asking a single question, without giving Skye the opportunity to explain, I had convinced myself that our marriage might already be slipping away. As I sat alone inside my truck, staring at the front door of the home we had built together, I understood that the hardest part wasn't what I had seen. It was the story I had begun telling myself about what it meant. I remained in my truck long after the engine stopped. The dashboard clock quietly changed from 5:2007 to 5:31. Yet I never reached for the door handle. The front porch looked exactly as it always had. Our flower pots sat beneath the windows. The small American flag near the walkway moved gently in the warm evening breeze. A delivery box rested beside the front door, untouched. Everything outside our house looked so familiar that it almost felt cruel. Inside my head, nothing felt familiar anymore. I kept replaying what I'd seen across that parking lot. Skye placing her hands on the teenage boy's shoulders, the smile they shared, the hug. I reminded myself again that I hadn't heard a single word. I reminded myself that people hugged for countless reasons. Family members hugged. Teachers hugged former students after graduation. People hugged when saying goodbye after difficult conversations. There were explanations that had nothing to do with betrayal. I knew that. Yet another voice inside me answered just as quickly. If it were innocent, why didn't she tell you? That question lingered longer than every other thought. Eventually I climbed out of the truck. By the time I stepped inside, Skye was already in the kitchen. She looked over her shoulder and smiled the same warm smile she had greeted me with hundreds of times before. There you are. Traffic. She glanced at the clock. Must have been pretty bad. It wasn't moving much. I almost called. I left my phone on silent. Long day. You could say that. She walked over and kissed my cheek. Dinner's almost ready. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh herbs filled the room. Normally, it would have made me hungry. That evening I barely noticed it. You okay? She asked. I'm fine. She studied my face. You look tired. Just worn out. You've been saying that a lot lately. I know. For a brief second, I thought she might ask something else. Instead, she simply nodded. Go wash up. I'll set the table. I've already done it. I'll pour the drinks. She smiled. Now you're stealing my job. I figured I'd help. I won't complain. I walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and reached for the iced tea. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Inside I felt anything but steady. Dinner passed, with a strange kind of politeness. We still talked. We still asked each other about our day. But I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. Every time Skye mentioned school, my mind immediately wondered whether the teenage boy had been involved somehow. She spoke about a teacher whose classroom had lost power. I silently wondered if she'd seen him afterward. She mentioned students preparing for a reading event. I wondered if he volunteered there. She laughed about one of the office printers refusing to cooperate. Instead of laughing with her, I found myself watching her face, looking for something, a hesitation, a guilty expression, any sign that matched the story growing inside my mind. I found nothing, only sky. The same thoughtful woman I'd shared a home with for years. That should have reassured me. Instead, it confused me even more. That night I lay awake beside her. The ceiling fan turned slowly above us. Outside, a distant train horn echoed through the quiet darkness before fading away. Beside me, Sky slept peacefully. She shifted slightly, rolling toward my side of the bed, almost without thinking. Her hand brushed against my arm. It was something she'd done countless times over the years. A small, unconscious habit. Normally, I'd gently squeeze her hand before falling asleep myself. Instead, I stared into the darkness. I wondered whether she'd reached for me out of habit or love. The moment that thought entered my mind, I immediately hated myself for it. When had I become someone who questioned gestures that had always been genuine? I quietly slipped out of bed. The digital clock read 2:14 a.m. I walked downstairs without turning on any lights. The living room felt unusually large in the darkness. I sat in my favorite chair and listened. The refrigerator hummed softly. Tree branches brushed against the windows outside. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once before everything became quiet again. Sleep wasn't coming back. Neither were answers. Over the next several nights, the pattern repeated itself. I'd fall asleep for an hour or two. Wake up. Replay the parking lot in my mind. Try convincing myself there had to be another explanation. Then argue against that explanation before finally drifting back to sleep just before sunrise. The lack of rest slowly followed me into work. On Monday morning, I accidentally ordered the wrong replacement part for a customer's furnace inspection scheduled later that week. Tuesday afternoon, I climbed halfway onto a rooftop before realizing I'd left my safety harness inside the truck. Marcus looked up from below. "You forgetting things again?" I climbed back down. Apparently, he handed me the harness. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm getting there." "You've been getting there for 2 weeks." "I know." He waited. I could tell he wanted to ask more. Instead, he simply said, "Take care of yourself." "I will." Even after he walked away, I stood there holding the harness longer than necessary. Marcus wasn't criticizing me. He was worried. That realization bothered me almost as much as my mistakes. For nearly 20 years, customers trusted me because I paid attention to details. Now my own thoughts kept stealing that attention. One afternoon, I arrived at a long-time customer's house nearly 20 minutes late. As soon as I stepped through the front door, Mr. Williams smiled. "I was about to send out a search party. I owe you an apology." "Everything all right?" "Running behind." He looked at me for a moment. "You usually call." "I should have." "You've got too much on your mind?" I laughed quietly. "Is it that obvious? I've known you a long time." He gestured toward the hallway. "Whatever it is, I hope it works out." "So do I." While inspecting his air conditioning system, I caught myself reading the same pressure gauge twice. Not because I doubted the numbers, because I couldn't remember whether I'd actually looked at them the first time. That frightened me. I wasn't simply distracted anymore. My distraction was beginning to affect people who depended on me. The hardest part wasn't losing sleep. It wasn't making mistakes at work. It wasn't even the uncertainty. It was what uncertainty began doing to my memories. I found myself replaying moments from our marriage that had once made me smile. The weekend Sky surprised me with tickets to a baseball game after I'd spent months saying I was too busy to go. The Christmas morning, when she'd laughed because I'd wrapped her present upside down. The afternoon, we'd painted our living room together and somehow ended up with more paint on ourselves than on the walls. For years, those memories had been simple reminders of a happy marriage. Now I caught myself wondering whether I'd missed signs hidden inside them. Had there been afternoons she disappeared without explaining? Had I ignored questions because I trusted too easily? Had she always carried a part of her life that I'd never known about? Each memory that once brought comfort now returned carrying doubt alongside it. Not because the memories had changed, because the first had. One unanswered question had quietly found its way into places it never belonged. By the end of that week, I understood something about fear that I'd never appreciated before. Fear rarely arrives by shouting. It enters quietly. It asks one reasonable question, then another. Before long, it begins rewriting ordinary moments, until certainty feels impossible to recover. Sitting alone in my truck after another long workday, I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. I couldn't keep living inside assumptions. Whether the truth hurt or healed us, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Soon, silence itself would become more damaging than whatever answer waited on the other side of an honest conversation. The decision to talk to someone else about my marriage didn't come easily. For days, I convinced myself I could sort everything out alone. I'd always been that way. When business problems came up, I stayed late until they were solved. When a furnace failed during a winter storm, I figured out a way to get heat back into the house before worrying about sleep. When money was tight during the first years of my HVAC company, I simply worked longer hours. This felt different. No amount of extra effort could answer the questions living in my head. By Monday afternoon, I admitted something I hadn't wanted to admit. I needed another perspective. Not because I wanted someone to tell me what to believe, because I could no longer trust my own thinking. Marcus was finishing paperwork at the shop when I walked into the office. He looked up immediately. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one that says you've been carrying something around for too long." I leaned against the doorway. "You got a minute?" He pushed the paperwork aside. "As many as you need." For several seconds, I stared through the office window toward the service trucks parked outside. Finding the right place to begin felt harder than I expected. Finally, I spoke. "If you thought someone close to you was hiding something..." Marcus didn't interrupt. "But you weren't completely sure." He remained silent. "What would you do?" He folded his hands. "Depends." "On what?" "How much evidence I actually had." I nodded slowly. "I've seen something." "What kind of something?" "I'm not ready to get into details." He respected that. "Okay, I just don't know what to think." Marcus took his time before answering. "You know what gets people into trouble?" "What's that?" "They stop separating facts from assumptions." I looked at him. "What are the facts?" "I know what I saw." "That's not what I asked." He spoke calmly, not critically. "What are the actual facts?" I thought about it. "I saw someone meeting the same teenager every Thursday." "That's a fact." "They hugged." "Also a fact." "I don't know why." "Exactly." He leaned back in his chair. "Everything after that," he pointed gently toward me, "comes from here. My imagination." "Maybe," he shrugged. "Or maybe your instincts." "So which is it?" "I honestly don't know." "Neither did I," Marcus continued. "If you think there's more to discover, don't accuse somebody based on guesses." He chose each word carefully. "Learn enough that you know what you're talking about first." "You think I should keep watching?" "I think you should make decisions based on facts." He paused. "Not fear." His advice stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Facts, not fear. Simple words, harder to live by. As I drove home, I wondered whether I'd already crossed that line. How many conclusions had I reached without realizing it? Too many. Still, another part of me wasn't satisfied. Gathering more information sounded reasonable. But how much would ever be enough? One more Thursday? Another month? Another silent video? At what point would watching become its own kind of dishonesty? 2 days later, I stopped by my older sister's house after finishing an air conditioning repair nearby. She answered the door wearing gardening gloves and immediately smiled. Well, this is a surprise. I was working close. Come inside. I can't stay long. You always say that, she laughed. And somehow you're still here an hour later. I've got better excuses today. We'll see. She poured 2 glasses of iced tea before either of us sat down. She knew me well enough to notice something was wrong before I spoke. You look exhausted. I haven't been sleeping much. Work? I hesitated. No, she waited. Unlike most people, she never rushed silence. Eventually, I told her enough to explain why I'd been struggling. Not every detail, not every thought, just the facts. The cameras, the Thursdays, the teenage boy, the hug I'd witnessed from across the parking lot. When I finished, she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she asked a question. Have you talked to Sky? I looked down at my glass. And no. Why not? I wanted to understand first. She nodded thoughtfully. I understand that. I didn't want to accuse her unfairly. That's good. But now, I don't know what to do. She leaned forward. Can I tell you what worries me most? Of course. You've been carrying this alone. I didn't want to burden anybody. I'm not talking about me. She smiled gently. I'm talking about your wife. I looked up. You've been having an entire conversation inside your own head. She tapped the table softly. Sky hasn't been part of it. I didn't answer, because she was right. She continued. If she's done something wrong, you'll eventually learn that. And if she hasn't, then every day you wait is another day she doesn't understand why you've become distant. Her words settled over the room. I just don't want to look foolish. She smiled sadly. Thompson, I know. No. She reached across the table and rested her hand on mine. Being honest with your wife has never made you foolish. I swallowed quietly. What if I ask the question, and I don't like the answer? She held my gaze. What if you never ask it, and spend the rest of your life believing something that isn't true? Driving home, I realized I'd been given 2 completely different paths. Marcus believed I should continue gathering facts before reaching a conclusion. My sister believed I already had enough to begin an honest conversation. Neither of them dismissed what I'd seen. Neither insisted I was right. Neither claimed to know the truth. They simply approached the uncertainty from different directions. One protected against false accusations. The other protected against silence. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had begun to set behind the trees lining our street. Sky's SUV was already there. The same vehicle I'd followed. The same vehicle that had carried donated books across town. The same vehicle where every unanswered question seemed to begin. I remained seated for another minute. Marcus's words echoed in one ear. Facts, not fear. My sister's words echoed in the other. Sky hasn't been part of the conversation happening inside your head. For the first time since those security cameras had changed everything, I understood that waiting any longer carried its own risk. If I continued saying nothing, I wouldn't simply be protecting myself from a difficult conversation. I might also be allowing my imagination to become louder than the truth. As I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door, I made a quiet decision. The next conversation with Sky wouldn't be about accusations. It would begin with a question. And whatever happened afterward, I wanted us both to be in the same conversation at last. I stood outside our front door for several seconds before reaching for the handle. The porch light had just switched on automatically as the evening sky faded from blue into soft shades of orange and gray. Somewhere down the street, children were finishing a game of basketball before their parents called them inside. The familiar sounds of our neighborhood had always brought me comfort. That evening, they only reminded me how ordinary life could appear while something important waited behind a closed door. I took one slow breath. When I stepped inside, the smell of tomato soup and grilled cheese greeted me. Sky looked up from the stove. There you are. I stopped by the shop. Everything okay? Yeah. She smiled. I made something simple tonight. It smells good. I figured neither of us needed anything complicated. She placed 2 bowls on the table before noticing that I hadn't taken off my work boots. You all right? I nodded automatically, just thinking. She pulled out my chair. You've been doing a lot of that lately. I know. Sit down. Her voice was gentle. We'll eat before the soup gets cold. Normally, I would have done exactly that. Instead, I remained standing. Skye noticed immediately. The smile on her face faded, replaced by quiet concern. Thompson? I looked at the table, then back at her. Can we talk first? She searched my face. Not with fear, with concern. Of course. She turned the burner off beneath the soup pot and walked toward the living room. Let's sit. A few moments later, we found ourselves on opposite ends of the couch, where we'd spent countless evenings reading books, watching baseball games, and laughing at old movies. The silence between us felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just important. Skye folded one leg beneath herself. What happened? I rested my hands together, trying to find the right words. I don't want this conversation to sound like an accusation. She listened without interrupting. I don't want to argue. Still she waited. I just need you to answer something honestly. I will. Her answer came without hesitation. I nodded slowly. A few weeks ago. My throat tightened. I started reviewing the security camera recordings. She didn't react. We'd installed them because of the package thefts. I remember. I wasn't looking for anything except missing deliveries. She continued watching me. I noticed something. Her shoulders became slightly still. You leave every Thursday? Yes. There's a teenage boy who meets you outside. She lowered her eyes. You walk away together. Silence. I followed you last Thursday. Another long silence settled between us. I continued quietly. I saw you unload boxes from your SUV. She didn't deny it. I watched the 2 of you come back outside. Her breathing became slower. I saw you hug him. The room remained completely quiet. No excuses, no interruption, no immediate explanation. That silence answered one question before either of us spoke another word. She knew exactly what I was talking about. I wasn't describing someone she'd forgotten. I wasn't confusing her with another person. She knew. When she finally looked up again, her eyes had begun to fill with tears. Not dramatic tears, not loud sobbing, just the kind that arrive before someone has found the strength to speak. You saw us. It wasn't a question. Ah, no. She stopped, pressed both hands together, tried again. You followed me. I did. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was disappointment in them. Not anger, not resentment, sadness. I wish you hadn't had to. Those 6 words caught me completely off guard. They weren't defensive. They weren't the response of someone trying to escape responsibility. They sounded like someone carrying something heavy for far too long. I leaned forward. Skye. I'm sorry. The apology came so quickly that I almost interrupted her. I should have told you. My heartbeat quickened. So there is something. She nodded once. There is. Another tear slipped down her cheek. I've been trying to find the right time. Trying to tell me? Yes. How long? She looked toward the floor. A long time. The answer landed harder than I expected. A long time. I kept convincing myself that next week would be better. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Then next month. She gave a small, painful smile that disappeared almost immediately. Eventually, too much time had passed. I struggled to process what I was hearing. So, every Thursday. She nodded again. Yes. You've been meeting him. Yes. And you've hidden it from me. I have. The honesty in her voice made it impossible to mistake. She wasn't avoiding the question. She wasn't pretending I had misunderstood. She was admitting it. "I know how it looks," she whispered. "I've imagined this conversation more times than you could ever believe." "Then why didn't you tell me?" She took a shaky breath. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" She looked directly into my eyes for the first time since the conversation began. "Afraid that once you knew," her voice broke, "you'd never look at me the same way again." I wanted to ask a dozen questions at once. Who was the teenager? How had they met? Why every Thursday? Why keep it hidden? Instead, I stayed quiet. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't listening to my imagination. I was listening to my wife. She reached for a tissue from the coffee table. Her hands trembled. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know." "No." She shook her head slowly. "You don't." Another tear rolled down her face. "I've lived with this secret for years." Years. The word echoed inside my mind. Not weeks, not months. Years. She looked toward the family photographs displayed on the bookshelf. Pictures from holidays, birthdays, weekend trips, ordinary moments that had built our life together. I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone. She swallowed hard. But every year I stayed silent. She closed her eyes. It became harder to tell the truth. The room fell quiet once more. This silence felt different from all the others. It wasn't filled with suspicion anymore. It was filled with anticipation. Not because every answer had finally arrived. Because for the first time, the truth itself had begun to step into the room. Sky slowly lifted her head, met my eyes again, and spoke with a quiet honesty that carried more weight than anything she had said that evening. "Before I explain who that young man is," she paused, gathering the courage she had been postponing for years, "there's something about my past that I've never told you." And with those words, I understood that the story I had spent weeks inventing inside my own mind was about to be replaced by the truth she had carried alone for far too long. The room remained quiet after Sky's last sentence. Neither of us moved. The soup she had prepared sat untouched in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly down our street before disappearing into the distance. The ordinary sounds of the evening continued, as though nothing significant had happened. Inside our living room, everything had changed. I looked at the woman I had shared my life with. She wasn't avoiding my eyes anymore. She wasn't trying to defend herself. She looked exhausted, not from the school day, not from the conversation, from carrying something that had clearly become heavier with every passing year. She took a slow breath before speaking again. "I need you to hear everything." I nodded. "I will. I know this won't erase the hurt." "It won't." She accepted that, without argument. I don't want you filling in the blanks anymore." For the first time in weeks, neither did I. She folded her hands together, stared at them for a moment, and quietly began. "I was 19. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'd just finished my first year of college." She paused, gathering herself. "I thought I had my whole life planned." I remained silent. My family wasn't doing well financially. My mom was working 2 jobs, and my younger brother was still in high school. She looked toward the window without really seeing it. Money was always tight. She smiled sadly. "We measured groceries carefully every week because we had to." I had never heard her speak much about those years. She'd occasionally mentioned that life had been difficult growing up, but she had never gone into detail. Now I understood why. "I met someone during my first semester." She stopped long enough to wipe another tear from her cheek. We cared about each other. She wasn't trying to rewrite history. She wasn't pretending she'd been perfect. She simply stated the truth. "When I found out I was pregnant," her voice caught, "I was terrified." She closed her eyes briefly before continuing. "I kept asking myself how I could tell my mother." I could almost picture the 19-year-old version of Sky sitting alone with that fear. "I knew she loved me." Another pause. "I also knew she was already carrying more responsibility than anyone should." She swallowed. I couldn't bear the thought of becoming another burden. The sadness in her voice wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The kind that settles into someone's life over many years. I hid the pregnancy for as long as I could. My chest tightened. I wore oversized sweatshirts. She gave a faint, embarrassed smile. I became very good at making excuses. Sky. She gently shook her head. Please, let me finish. He nodded. She deserved that. When my family finally found out, everyone reacted differently. She looked down again. My mother cried. Her own eyes filled again at the memory. Not because she stopped loving me. A tear slipped onto her hand. Because she knew how frightened I was. She took another careful breath. We talked about every possibility. Keeping the baby. Leaving school. Finding work. Moving back home. Every option carried consequences. Nothing felt simple. She rested both hands on her knees, as though steadying herself. Eventually, someone connected us with a licensed adoption counselor. I listened without interrupting. They never pressured me. She spoke those words firmly. They explained every choice available to me. She looked directly at me. I want you to know that. I do. They told me I could decide to parent. She nodded slowly. They explained temporary assistance programs. They talked about relatives raising the baby. They explained closed adoption. And they explained open adoption. She stopped for several seconds. I asked more questions than anyone in that office probably expected. A fragile smile crossed her face. I wanted to know what kind of life my baby might have. The smile disappeared almost immediately. I wasn't looking for the easiest decision. I was looking for the one I believed would give my child the best chance. The room became quiet again, not because she had run out of words, because some memories simply required space. Finally, she continued. I chose a legal, open adoption. The words landed gently. I made that decision because I wanted my child to grow up knowing that he had never been abandoned. Another tear rolled down her cheek. I wanted him to know he was loved. She covered her mouth for a moment before speaking again. Sometimes loving someone means admitting another family can give them what you can't. I felt my own eyes sting. The image I'd carried in my mind for weeks no longer matched the woman sitting across from me. Not because the truth erased the pain, because it revealed a completely different kind of pain. She continued quietly. The adoption happened exactly the way the agreement described. She stared toward the family photographs again. I left the hospital carrying an empty bag. The sentence was simple. Its weight was enormous. For months afterward, she stopped, tried again. I'd wake up reaching for a baby who wasn't there. Neither of us spoke. I finished school. I found work. I slowly rebuilt my life. She gave a tired smile. Eventually, people stopped asking questions. She looked at me with remarkable honesty, but I never stopped asking them myself. I leaned forward slightly. You carried that alone? She nodded. For a very long time. Didn't anyone help you? My mother did. She smiled softly through her tears. She reminded me over and over that making a painful decision didn't make me a bad person. Another pause. I wanted to believe her. She lowered her voice. But shame has a way of speaking louder than kindness. She looked around the living room we had built together. When you came into my life, a different expression appeared on her face, one filled with warmth. You made me feel safe. I couldn't speak. I wanted to tell you everything. She laughed once, though there was no humor in it. I even practiced the conversation while driving home from work. You did? So many times. What stopped you? She looked at me with complete honesty. I became afraid. that the moment you heard I had a child before we met." She paused. "You would see me differently." I slowly shook my head. "You don't know that." "I know," she nodded sadly. "That's what makes fear so powerful." Another quiet moment passed between us. I convinced myself I was protecting the life we'd built. She looked down at her wedding ring. "I didn't realize I was also building a wall between us." I sat back against the couch, absorbing every word. For weeks, I had believed I was uncovering evidence of another relationship. Instead, I had uncovered the deepest wound my wife had been carrying since she was 19. I still hurt. The years of silence mattered. The secrecy mattered. But as I looked at Sky, I no longer saw someone who had been living a double life. I saw someone who had spent years trying to outrun a chapter of her past that had never truly stopped walking beside her. She quietly wiped her eyes once more. "There is still more you need to know." Her voice was steadier now. "Because none of this explains why you saw me with that young man every Thursday." He nodded. She took one slow breath. "The answer to that didn't begin 19 years ago." She met my eyes. "It began only a few months ago, when my past unexpectedly found its way back into our present." Neither of us stood. The distance between us on the couch remained the same, yet the conversation felt entirely different now. For weeks, I had been searching for signs of deception. Instead, I had found grief. Not fresh grief, the kind that had quietly settled into someone's life until carrying it simply became part of every ordinary day. Sky reached for a glass of water from the coffee table and took a careful sip. "I've replayed this moment in my mind for years," she said softly. "I always imagined it differently." "So did I." A faint, tired smile crossed her face. "I don't think either of us expected this." No." She nodded once. "I should have trusted you." The sentence wasn't offered as an excuse. It was an admission. "I wanted to," she continued. "There were so many times." I stayed quiet. "I remember the first time I almost told you." She looked toward the hallway as if she could still see the memory waiting there. "It was before we got married." I listened. "We were sitting in your truck after dinner." She smiled sadly. "You'd spent the entire evening talking about how honesty mattered more to you than anything else." I remember saying that. I remember thinking." She paused. "This is it. This is the moment." "What happened?" "I became afraid." She didn't hesitate. "I imagined telling you everything." She looked down at her hands. "Then I imagined you quietly driving me home without saying another word." I opened my mouth to respond. She gently shook her head. "I know. You don't know what I would have done." "I don't." Her voice remained calm. "But fear doesn't wait for certainty." She folded her hands together again. "It writes its own ending." I thought back to the past few weeks. I'd done exactly the same thing. I had watched silent videos and allowed my imagination to write a story before hearing a single explanation. The realization settled heavily inside me. Sky continued. "After we got married, I told myself I'd bring it up on our first anniversary." She gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "I even bought a notebook." "A notebook?" I thought writing everything down first would help me find the right words. Did it? I filled almost half of it. What happened to it? "It's still in a box upstairs." She looked toward the ceiling. "I never had the courage to hand it to you." She took another slow breath. "Every year I convinced myself it had become more difficult." "Why?" "Because every year that passed created another question." "What question?" She met my eyes. "If you trusted me enough to marry me, why didn't you tell me then?" I understood. Not because I agreed with the decision, because I could see how the fear had grown. "The longer I waited," she continued, "the more impossible it felt." She gave another tired smile. "I kept telling myself there would be a better time." There never was. No, there never was. The room fell quiet again. This silence no longer felt hostile. It felt thoughtful. Two people trying to understand how years of good intentions and fear had become years of secrecy. After a moment, I asked the question that had stayed with me since the security footage. The teenager. She nodded immediately. His name is Micah. Hearing a name somehow made everything more real. He turned 16 earlier this year. I listened without interrupting. A few months ago, the adoption agency contacted me. They contacted you? Yes, she nodded. The adoption had always been legally open. I knew the agreement allowed future contact if everyone involved agreed. She paused. But until this year, nobody felt it was the right time. What changed? Micah. She smiled through fresh tears. He reached the age where he wanted to ask questions himself. She continued carefully. His adoptive parents respected that. They never tried to replace me. They were simply his parents. Her voice carried genuine gratitude. They raised him with love. They told him about the adoption in an age-appropriate way as he grew up. They never hid where he came from. I found myself exhaling slowly. So when he wanted to meet you, they contacted the agency first. The agency contacted me. She looked directly at me. They asked whether I was willing. Were you? I was terrified. She laughed softly through her tears. I cried for almost an hour after that phone call. I didn't know whether saying yes would help him. She swallowed. I didn't know whether saying no would hurt him. So you agreed? I did, she nodded. But only after speaking with the counselor several times. She wanted me to understand every step. Nothing happened suddenly. There were meetings. There were guidelines. There were conversations about expectations. Everyone wanted to make sure the meetings were healthy for him. And for me, I thought back to everything I'd witnessed. The books. Her face brightened for the first time that evening. Micah loves reading. He always has. His adoptive parents told me he spends hours at the library. She smiled. When the school received all those donated books, you thought of him? I thought of the reading program. She corrected herself gently. The community center runs a literacy group every Thursday afternoon. They needed more books, so I offered the donations. And Micah volunteers there. Pieces began fitting together. The boxes, the community building, the Thursdays, the reading program. Everything I had seen had belonged to one consistent story, one I simply hadn't known. The meetings were always planned. She emphasized the point quietly. Never secret in the legal sense. The agency knew. His adoptive parents knew. I knew. She lowered her eyes. The only person who didn't know. She couldn't finish the sentence. I did it for her. Was me? She nodded. Yes. Another silence settled between us, not because we had run out of words, because the truth required room to breathe. I should have trusted you with it from the beginning, she whispered. I thought I was protecting our marriage. She looked at me with complete honesty. I never realized that hiding something out of fear could wound the very person I was trying to protect. I looked toward the family photographs on the bookshelf, then back at Sky. For weeks, I'd believed every Thursday had been taking her farther away from me. Now I understood. They had been leading her toward a young man who wasn't the symbol of an affair. He was the living reminder of one of the hardest decisions she had ever made. Even knowing that, the ache inside me remained. Not because another man had come between us, but because years of silence had. The room was quiet again. Not the uneasy silence that had filled our home over the previous weeks. This one felt different. The truth had finally entered the conversation, and neither of us wanted to rush past it. Sky stood slowly. I need to show you something. He nodded. Without another word, she walked upstairs. I remained on the couch, listening to the familiar sounds of our home. A closet door opened. A drawer slid shut. Footsteps crossed the bedroom floor. A few moments later, she returned carrying a worn blue storage box. She held it carefully, almost the way someone carries an object that means more than its appearance suggests. She sat beside me, not as close as she normally would, but closer than before, and placed the box on the coffee table. "I've kept these for years." She looked at me before lifting the lid. "I've never shown them to anyone except my mother." Inside were neatly organized folders, envelopes, and a notebook with softened corners from years of handling. She reached for the notebook first. "The one I told you about." I recognized it immediately from our earlier conversation. She rested it in my hands. "I wrote in it every time I almost told you." I looked at the cover without opening it. "You don't have to read all of it tonight." "I want to." "You can." She gave a small nod. "But there are other things you should see first." She removed a folder containing official documents. Every page was carefully preserved inside clear protective sleeves. I examined the first page. It identified the licensed adoption agency that had handled the placement years earlier. The next pages outlined the legal open adoption agreement. There were dates, official signatures, court filings. Everything was exactly what she had described. Nothing looked improvised. Nothing appeared hidden for the purpose of deceiving anyone. Every document reflected a legal process completed years before I had ever met Skye. She quietly pointed to another section. "Those are the recent letters." I opened the folder. Inside were copies of correspondence from the agency. The first letter explained that Micah had expressed a desire to learn more about his biological history and had requested contact through the established legal process. Another document summarized meetings with counselors before any contact took place. There were recommendations, guidelines, consent forms. The timeline matched what Skye had told me. Every Thursday meeting had been scheduled. Every visit had been approved. Nothing had happened in secret except her decision to keep it from me. I lowered the papers onto the coffee table. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I looked at her. "There was never another relationship." She slowly shook her head. "Never? There wasn't someone else?" "No." "You weren't meeting him behind my back because of an affair?" "No." Her answer never changed. Not once. The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. I leaned back and rubbed both hands across my face. I spent weeks convincing myself I'd lost my marriage. I know. I questioned everything. I know. I looked at years of memories and wondered if they were real. Fresh tears filled her eyes. "I'm so sorry." I believed her. That surprised me. Not because she had finally explained everything, because her remorse felt completely genuine. She wasn't asking me to ignore the hurt. She wasn't asking me to pretend the secrecy hadn't mattered. She simply accepted responsibility for it. "I understand why you were afraid," I said quietly. She looked at me. "I don't agree with what you chose. I wouldn't expect you to. But I understand the fear." She covered her mouth for a moment as another tear escaped. "I wish I had trusted you." "So do I." Neither answer erased the pain. Both could exist at the same time. I looked down at the notebook still resting in my lap. "You carried this by yourself for years." "Yes. And then I carried my own story by myself for weeks." She nodded sadly. "We both spent too much time alone." The sentence hung gently between us. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. One built from painful experience. "I thought silence was protecting us," Skye whispered. "It wasn't." "No, it was protecting my fear." I thought about Marcus reminding me to separate facts from assumptions. I thought about my sister telling me that Skye deserved to be part of the conversation taking place inside my own head. Both of them had been right in different ways. I had allowed assumptions to grow. Skye had allowed fear to grow. Neither of those choices had protected our marriage. Honesty would have. I reached across the coffee table and closed the blue storage box. "I'm relieved." She looked surprised. "You are?" "I am." I took a slow breath. "I'm relieved because I know you didn't betray our marriage with another relationship." She nodded, tears continuing to fall silently. "But—" The words stopped both of us. "My relief doesn't erase the hurt." "I know. I need you to understand that." "I do." "For weeks, I believed something completely different because I didn't have the truth." She lowered her eyes. "And that's on me." "Yes." She accepted the answer without defending herself. "I don't expect tonight to fix everything. It won't. I don't expect you to wake up tomorrow and pretend none of this happened." "I can't." She nodded again. "I wouldn't respect you if you did." That sentence stayed with me. It sounded exactly like the Sky I had known for years. Honest, thoughtful, willing to face difficult truths instead of running from them. I looked at our wedding photograph sitting on the bookshelf. We've always told people that trust is built a little at a time. We have. I guess rebuilding it works the same way. She followed my eyes to the photograph. "I think it does." Neither of us promised that everything would be easy. Neither of us made dramatic declarations about putting the past behind us overnight. Life didn't work that way. Neither did marriage. "I love you," Sky said quietly. The words carried no pressure, no expectation, only honesty. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I love you too." The answer came naturally. Love had never disappeared. It had simply become buried beneath unanswered questions. "I just need time." "I'll give you all the time you need. And I need complete honesty from now on." "You'll have it, no matter how difficult the truth is." "I promise." For the first time in weeks, there were no silent security recordings standing between us. No imagined conversations. No assumptions filling empty spaces. There was still pain. There was still healing ahead. But there was finally something stronger than either of those things. The truth. And for the first time since the security camera captured a mystery neither of us expected, we were facing it together instead of alone. The morning after our conversation felt unfamiliar. Not because everything had suddenly become better. Because everything was finally honest. For the first time in weeks, neither Sky nor I had to guess what the other was thinking. That didn't mean the hurt had disappeared. It simply meant the silence had. I woke before sunrise, a habit I had kept for years. The house was still. Soft morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains as I quietly dressed for work. When I walked downstairs, I found Sky already sitting at the kitchen table. She wasn't reading. She wasn't preparing breakfast. She simply sat with a mug of coffee cradled between both hands. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up. "Morning." "Morning." For a brief second, we weren't sure how to greet each other. That uncertainty hurt more than either of us expected. Finally, I walked over and kissed the top of her head. It wasn't automatic. It was a choice. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you." I pulled out the chair across from her. Neither of us rushed to fill the quiet. After everything we'd shared the night before, silence no longer felt like an enemy. It simply needed time. Sky wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been thinking." "So have I. I don't want you carrying questions anymore." "I appreciate that." She nodded slowly. "I spoke with the agency this morning." I looked up. "So early?" "I didn't sleep much." "Neither had I." "They said everyone would understand if you wanted to meet Micah." The suggestion lingered between us. "I don't want to pressure you." She chose her words carefully. "If you're not ready, I think I need to." Her eyes searched mine. "You do?" He nodded. "I spent weeks creating someone in my imagination." I looked down at my coffee. "I think it's time I meet the actual person." Fresh emotion appeared in her eyes, but this time she smiled through it. "I'll ask if he's comfortable with that." I don't want him to feel obligated. He won't. She paused. He wanted to meet you eventually. I blinked. He did? She smiled gently. He said. She laughed softly through lingering emotion. That anyone I'd chosen to spend my life with must matter to me. I wasn't sure how to respond. The sentence stayed with me for the rest of the morning. 3 days later, after several conversations coordinated through the adoption agency, we agreed to meet at the same community center where Sky had been volunteering every Thursday. This time there would be no following from a distance. No hiding inside a parked truck. No silent security footage. Just people sitting down together. The afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk as I parked beside Sky's SUV. My hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment. You nervous? She asked. I smiled faintly. I've repaired air conditioners on top of 3-story buildings. She waited. This somehow feels harder. She reached over and gently squeezed my hand. You don't have to prove anything today. I know. We're just meeting. He nodded. Just meeting. Before getting out of the SUV, she looked at me. Thank you. For what? For giving this a chance. I answered honestly. I'm giving the truth a chance. She didn't say anything else. She simply smiled. The community center looked different when I wasn't watching it through a windshield. Children's artwork decorated the hallway. Bookshelves lined one wall near the entrance. Several volunteers arranged folding chairs for what looked like an afternoon reading group. The atmosphere felt welcoming, ordinary. Nothing about it resembled the secret world my imagination had created. A volunteer greeted us with a smile before leading us toward a quiet meeting room. We'll give you all the privacy you need. Thank you, Sky replied. A few moments later, the door opened again. The teenage boy stepped inside. Micah. He looked almost exactly as he had on the security footage. Toe. A backpack slung over one shoulder. The same thoughtful expression I'd seen from a distance. Only now there was something else I hadn't noticed before. He looked just as nervous as I felt. He stopped a few feet inside the room. Hi. His voice was calm but tentative. Hi. For a second, none of us moved. Sky smiled gently. Micah. She looked toward me. This is Thompson. He immediately extended his hand. It's nice to meet you, sir. I stood and shook it. His handshake was respectful, neither too firm nor uncertain. You too. We sat down around a small round table. The first few moments felt exactly the way first meetings often do. Everyone searching for the right place to begin. Micah finally broke the silence. I know this probably isn't easy. I smiled slightly. And no, it isn't. He nodded. I figured. He looked toward Sky for just a second before returning his attention to me. I wanted to say something first. I waited. I'm not here because I'm trying to take anyone's place. The words came carefully, as though he had practiced them many times. I already have parents. He smiled warmly. They're wonderful. He looked back at me. They raised me. They're the people who taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with homework, embarrassed me at school events. That earned the first genuine laugh of the afternoon. Even Sky smiled. Micah laughed quietly too. My dad still tells terrible jokes. I understand that. I smiled. I've been accused of the same thing. He looked relieved. The tension eased just enough for everyone to breathe normally again. Micah continued. I didn't ask to meet Sky because something was missing. He chose every word with care. I asked because I wanted to understand another part of my story. He glanced briefly toward Sky. I've always known I was loved. His voice carried complete sincerity. My parents made sure of that. He looked back at me. I never wanted anyone thinking I was replacing them. I never wanted you thinking I was replacing you either. His last sentence caught me off guard. I frowned slightly. Replacing me? He nodded. I know you've been married to Sky for years. He smiled politely. I respect that. I respect your family. I just wanted the chance to know where part of my life began. There wasn't a trace of entitlement in his voice. No resentment, no expectation. Only quiet curiosity. I found myself studying him the way I once studied the silent security footage. The difference was remarkable. The camera had shown me movements. Now I was meeting the person behind those movements. There was kindness in the way he spoke, thoughtfulness in the way he listened, respect in the way he chose his words. None of those qualities had been visible through a lens. As the conversation continued, we talked about ordinary things. School, books, his interest in engineering, my HVAC business. He asked intelligent questions about how heating and cooling systems worked. I laughed. You really want to know? I like understanding how things fit together. I smiled. So do I. He grinned. Maybe that's why I like fixing bicycles. You repair bikes? Mostly for friends. Sometimes for kids in the neighborhood. I found myself genuinely interested. By the end of the afternoon, something unexpected had happened. I wasn't looking at Micah and seeing unanswered questions anymore. I wasn't seeing the silent figure from the security footage. I wasn't seeing the fear I'd carried for weeks. I was seeing a respectful 16-year-old who had entered a complicated situation with more maturity than many adults ever manage. As Sky and I walked back toward the SUV, neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, I looked over at her. I understand now. She searched my face. What do you understand? I spent weeks being afraid of someone I'd never actually met. She slipped her hand into mine. For the first time since this journey began, I held it without hesitation, and together we quietly walked toward whatever came next. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It didn't happen because of one conversation, one apology, or one afternoon at the community center. If anything, the weeks that followed taught me something I should have understood years earlier. Trust is built through countless ordinary choices. When it's damaged, it returns the very same way. One ordinary choice at a time. The Monday after meeting Micah, I walked into the kitchen, expecting the familiar rush of another work week. Sky was already packing lunches. She looked up as I entered. Morning. Morning. She hesitated for just a second. I wanted to tell you something before you hear it later. I smiled faintly. What is it? The agency emailed yesterday. They're scheduling another family check-in next month. She watched my face carefully. I'll probably attend. I set my coffee mug on the counter. Thanks for telling me. She let out a quiet breath. I almost waited until tonight. Why didn't you? A small smile appeared. Because that's how I used to think. She reached for her travel mug. I don't want to live that way anymore. Neither did I. That simple conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet somehow, it carried more weight than either of us expected. For the first time, she wasn't deciding whether I could handle difficult information. She was simply trusting me with it. The changes between us weren't dramatic. They were intentional. Instead of assuming, we asked. Instead of avoiding uncomfortable subjects, we talked about them while they were still small. Sometimes those conversations lasted 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. One evening, after dinner, I found Sky sitting on the back patio watching the sunset. I joined her. What are you thinking about? She smiled. Thank you for asking. I figured I'd try something new. She laughed softly. I was thinking about how easy it is to confuse protecting someone with protecting yourself. I understood exactly what she meant. I've been thinking about something similar. What? How quickly I filled in missing pieces without realizing I was doing it. She nodded. We both let fear make decisions. I guess we did. We sat quietly for a while, not because we had nothing left to say, because neither of us felt pressured to fill every moment with words. The silence between us no longer felt like distance. It felt comfortable again. Work gradually became enjoyable once more. Marcus noticed before I did. One afternoon, after finishing a repair, he leaned against the service truck and smiled. There he is. I looked up. Who? The guy who used to laugh at terrible jokes. I still laugh. You've laughed 6 times today. You counted again? I absolutely counted. I shook my head. You really need another hobby. I've got one. Apparently. He studied me for a second. Everything okay? I smiled honestly. We're working through it. He nodded. That's good enough. I appreciated that he didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. Sometimes the people who care about you simply want to know you're finding your way again. A few weeks later, Sky asked me a question while we were washing dishes together. Would you be comfortable meeting Micah's adoptive parents? I paused. They asked? They said only if you wanted to. What did you tell them? That I'd ask you first. I dried my hands on a towel. I think I'd like that. She smiled. They're good people. I believe you. The meeting took place at a neighborhood cafe on a Saturday morning. It wasn't formal. It wasn't awkward for very long either. They welcomed us with genuine kindness. There was no competition, no defensiveness. No one behaved as though they were protecting territory. Instead, everyone seemed focused on one thing, doing what was healthiest for Micah. Listening to them speak about him was unexpectedly comforting. They talked about teaching him to drive, about his habit of taking apart broken radios just to understand how they worked, about his love of books, about how he insisted on helping elderly neighbors carry groceries without being asked. As I listened, something became increasingly clear. They weren't trying to convince us they were good parents. They didn't have to. Their love for Micah was obvious in the smallest details. At one point, Micah excused himself to refill everyone's drinks. As soon as he walked away, I smiled. He's a good kid. His adoptive father laughed. We're pretty proud of him. You should be. His adoptive mother looked toward Sky. We've always wanted him to know where he came from. She smiled warmly. Knowing one chapter doesn't erase another. That sentence stayed with me long after we left. Life slowly found a new rhythm. Thursday afternoons no longer carried the weight they once had. Sometimes Sky attended the reading program. Sometimes she didn't. Whenever plans involved Micah, we talked about them openly. No guessing. No wondering. No silent videos becoming stories. One Thursday evening, Sky walked through the front door carrying an empty cardboard box. I looked up from the couch. No books left? She smiled proudly. Every single one found a new home. That's good. It is. She sat beside me. Micah asked whether your company ever takes summer interns. I laughed. I don't know if 16-year-olds dream about crawling through attics. He said he wants to understand how mechanical systems work. That actually sounds like him. She looked at me carefully. No pressure. I know. I thought about our conversation. I'd be willing to show him around the shop one afternoon. Her eyes brightened. Really? He's curious. I smiled. I like curious people. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you. It isn't just for him. What do you mean? I looked around our living room. For a long time, I believed loving someone meant loving only the parts of their story I already knew. She stayed quiet. I don't think that's true anymore. She waited. I think loving someone also means accepting that their life began before yours became part of it. Tears gathered gently in her eyes, not from sadness, from relief. I've spent years wishing you'd know all of me. She whispered the words carefully. I finally do. I looked at her wedding ring, then at mine. We can't erase what happened. I wouldn't ask you to, but we can decide what we build from here. She smiled. I'd like that. So would I. As autumn slowly settled over Jenks, new routines quietly joined the old ones. Sunday dinners, baseball games on television, walks through the farmer's market, occasional afternoons at the community center. Conversations that had become more honest than either of us imagined possible. The past hadn't disappeared. It had simply found its proper place, no longer hidden, no longer controlling every decision. Just another chapter that helped explain how we arrived where we were. And for the first time in a long while, our future no longer felt overshadowed by unanswered questions. It felt open enough for new memories to grow beside the old ones. By the time spring returned to Jenks, the security cameras had almost faded into the background again. They still recorded every movement around our house. Delivery drivers came and went. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. Children rode bicycles up and down the street after school. Most evenings, I didn't even think about opening the camera app. Life had become busy in all the right ways. The HVAC business stayed steady. Marcus continued pretending he wasn't keeping an eye on me, though every now and then he'd grin and say, "You haven't forgotten a single tool this month." I'd answer the same way every time. "Don't jinx it." He'd laugh. "I think you're back." I think so too. At home, Sky and I had settled into a rhythm that felt familiar without pretending the difficult months had never happened. Sometimes we'd still talk about the past, not because we were trapped there, because we'd learned that avoiding hard conversations never made them disappear. If something weighed on one of us, we said it. Sometimes the words came easily. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, we spoke them before silence had the chance to grow. One Thursday evening, while we were cleaning the kitchen after dinner, Sky looked over at me. "You know what today was?" I dried a plate with a dish towel. "Thursday," she smiled. "Besides that," I thought for a moment. "I give up." She leaned against the counter. "It's been 6 months since you met Micah." I stopped drying the plate. "Has it really?" She nodded. "It doesn't feel that long." I was thinking the same thing. For a moment, we simply stood there smiling. Not because 6 months had erased everything. Because 6 months of honest conversations had accomplished something that weeks of quiet worry never could. A few days later, a spring storm rolled across Oklahoma. The weather forecast had warned about strong winds all afternoon. By evening, rain hammered against the windows while tree branches swayed outside under powerful gusts. The lights flickered twice before settling again. Sky looked out the living room window. "I hope that old maple tree holds." "It usually does." A loud crack echoed somewhere outside. She turned toward me. "That didn't sound good." It didn't. The next morning, the neighborhood looked as though it had spent the night rearranging itself. Small branches covered sidewalks. Lawn furniture had blown across yards. One of our flower pots lay on its side near the porch. The wooden fence separating our yard from the Hendersons' property had taken the worst of it. Several sections leaned awkwardly, and one panel had completely fallen over. I stood outside with a tape measure, trying to decide how much lumber I'd need. A familiar voice called from the driveway. "Need another pair of hands?" I turned. Micah stood beside his bicycle, wearing work gloves and carrying a small toolbox. Behind him, Sky climbed out of her SUV. She smiled. "I hope you don't mind." I looked from one of them to the other. "I definitely don't mind." Micah walked over to the damaged fence. "I've helped repair ours before." He knelt beside one of the broken posts, examining it carefully. "I think we can save most of this." I smiled. "You sound pretty confident." He shrugged. "My dad taught me to check what's still usable before replacing everything." "That's good advice." "It usually saves money." I laughed. "I like your dad already. You'd probably get along." I think we would. For the next several hours, the three of us worked side by side. I cut replacement boards. Micah held posts steady while I secured them. Sky handed us tools, swept away broken pieces of wood, and occasionally reminded both of us to drink water whenever we became too focused on the work. At one point, I reached for my drill, only to realize I'd left it near the garage. Before I could move, Micah picked it up and handed it to me. "You almost forgot this?" I smiled. Marcus would never let me hear the end of that. "Who's Marcus?" "One of the guys at work. The one who counts how many times you laugh?" I looked toward Sky. "You told him that?" She tried not to laugh. It came up. Micah grinned. "That's actually pretty funny. It wasn't supposed to leave the house. It probably never will." The three of us laughed together. It was an ordinary moment, exactly the kind of moment I'd once believed would never happen. When we finished, the fence stood straighter than it had before the storm. I stepped back, wiping my forehead with the back of my arm. "Looks good." Micah nodded. "It should last a long time." "It will." Sky looked from the fence to both of us. "I think we earned lunch." "I won't argue with that," I said. Micah smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." That evening, after everyone had gone home and the dishes from lunch were washed, I remembered the security cameras. Old habit. I opened the app on my phone. The timeline showed the morning's activity. I pressed play. There was our front yard. After the storm, the damaged fence. Me walking outside with a tape measure. A few minutes later, Micah rode into the driveway with his toolbox balanced carefully on the back of his bicycle. Sky followed in her SUV. The recording showed the three of us working together. It captured Micah lifting fence panels. It captured me pointing toward the next post. It captured Sky laughing when I accidentally dropped a handful of screws into the grass, and both of us had to search for them. Watching the footage, I couldn't help smiling. Months earlier, this same camera had shown me silent moments that my imagination transformed into fear. The camera hadn't lied then. It wasn't lying now. It had simply recorded actions. Nothing more. The meaning had always depended on what I did next. This time I didn't need to invent a story. I had lived it. Sky walked into the living room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You watching the cameras again?" "I am." She set 1 mug beside me. "Anything interesting?" I turned the tablet so she could see the screen. The recording showed Micah handing me the drill I'd forgotten. She laughed. "You really did leave it behind. I'll never hear the end of that." "You probably won't." We watched another few moments in comfortable silence. Finally, I closed the app. "You know," I said quietly, "it's strange." "What is?" "I used to think those cameras changed our lives." She looked at me with curiosity. "You don't anymore?" I shook my head. "No. What changed our lives wasn't the camera." She waited. It was finally having the conversation we should have had. She reached for my hand. "I'm glad we did." "So am I." Outside, the repaired fence stood quietly beneath the evening sky. The cameras continued recording exactly as they always had. Cars passed. Neighbors waved. Life moved forward. Looking back now, I understand that a camera can preserve a moment with remarkable accuracy. It can show who arrived, who left, who smiled, and who embraced another person. What it can never capture is the reason behind those moments. Only honest conversations can do that. If there's one lesson our story left me with, it's this: when questions begin to grow, don't let silence answer them for you. The stories we create in our own minds are often far less truthful than the ones we're brave enough to share with each other. And sometimes, the strongest foundation a family can build isn't a life without difficult chapters. It's the willingness to face those chapters together, with honesty, patience, and grace.